Every neighborhood has that unbearable neighbor, the one who spies behind the curtains, the one who hands out warnings as if she were the sheriff of an Old West town. But this one? Ah, this one was a demon in high heels and a flowered blouse, with a glass of cheap wine in her hand and an ego the size of the entire state. Not only did she think she was the leader of the HOA, she was sure she was the supreme ruler of the neighborhood. And if Karen decided something wasn't up to her high standards, you could brace yourself. There would be fines, letters, threats, and that look of superiority on her face that made you want to throw a bag of garbage in front of her house just for the pleasure of seeing her frothing with rage. The unlucky one? My grandfather. My grandfather was always the type to take care of his own space. He didn't pick on anyone. He didn't complain about others. He just wanted the right to plant his flowers and water his plants in peace. But, apparently, a garden full of color and life was offensive to Karen's refined eyes. According to her, it didn't fit in with the minimalist aesthetic of the neighborhood, as if her dry, characterless lawn was some kind of museum-worthy work of art. At first, it was that classic HOA theatrics, letters demanding the removal of the plants, ridiculous notifications about how his grass was 2 inches higher than allowed, veiled threats of fines if he didn't follow the community guidelines. My grandfather ignored it all. He'd been living there longer than this woman even knew how to spell residence association, and he wasn't going to go pulling up her flowers because some crazy woman thought she could give orders. When the letters failed, the little attacks began. First, someone accidentally cut the garden's irrigation pipes. My grandfather fixed it. Then some plants were uprooted in the middle of the night. He replanted them. Then his car turned up with deep scratches on the bodywork. Then he was furious, but with no proof that Karen was behind it. He could only snort and move on. Only the woman wouldn't stop. Not being able to bend him made her even more committed to making his life hell. And then came the dirty trick. Out of nowhere, my grandfather began to feel ill. First it was sporadic dizziness, then frequent nausea. Sometimes he felt so weak that he could barely leave the house. At first, we thought it was just a viral illness or something old. But when even his dog, a mongrel who never got sick, started acting strange, vomiting, and refusing food, we knew there was something very wrong. The only thing the two had in common? Water. My grandfather had been drinking from that tap for years and never had a problem. But now, out of the blue, the water was making him sick? Something didn't make sense. I decided to take a sample and send it to a laboratory. The result? A huge slap in the face. Contaminated. And not just any contamination. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't rust. It was something put there on purpose. Something that, if consumed for too long, could really make someone very ill. Maybe even hospitalized. And that's when I knew. Karen didn't just want him to uproot the plants. She wanted him to leave. She wanted to make him sick, wear him out, have his house sold, and replaced by another one of those soulless shoeboxes she loved so much. And this wasn't just some annoying neighbor's tantrum. This was criminal. Now, any rational person would call the police, present the evidence, open an investigation, let justice take its course. But me? I'm not rational when it comes to my family. I wanted this woman to taste her own poison. So I spent nights studying the neighborhood's plumbing, mapping out the water connections, observing where each house received its pipe. It wasn't difficult. The systems were old, and with a little skill and a few borrowed tools, I could alter the flow of supply without leaving a trace. And that's exactly what I did. One silent dawn, while Karen was probably asleep in her bed of expensive sheets and cheap character, I went to the distribution system and tweaked the whole thing. Now, the water in her house came from the same pipe she had sabotaged, and all I had to do was wait for the show to begin. The hardest part about getting revenge on someone like Karen is that they have an unbelievable ability to play the victim. You can catch her in the act, with her hand in the cookie jar, and she'll still look at you like you're the villain in the story. so I knew I had to be careful. It wasn't enough just to change the course of the water. I had to wait for the magic to happen, and it didn't take long. On the first day, nothing happened. I mean, apparently nothing. Karen followed her usual routine. She left the house in that exaggerated heel that made a noise on the concrete, collected mail that was probably new finds for the neighbors, and, as usual, ignored anyone who tried to say a simple, "Good morning." But I knew that the new reality was setting in, and I couldn't wait to see the damage spread. The next morning, the gossip was already running wild. First, there was the delivery of bottled water. The truck stopped at her house and unloaded boxes and boxes of bottles, which was curious in itself, considering that Karen always made a point of saying that only peasants still drink bottled water in the 21st century. Well, it seems that something had convinced her to change her mind. Then came the first strange reports. The neighbor in front said she saw Karen complaining to the gardener. The poor guy was there, trying to figure out why the plants were starting to wilt. Her perfect lawn, that impeccable thing that looked like a green golf course carpet, was beginning to show signs that something was very, very wrong. And the most curious thing? Karen herself seemed a little down. She didn't get out of the house as much anymore. When she did, she was more impatient than usual. At the market, she freaked out at a cash register because she thought the change was wrong, which had never been a problem before. The woman was beginning to feel the effects of her own sabotage. But the best part was yet to come. On the third day, something glorious happened. It was a sunny morning. I was outside, pretending to trim some plants in the yard just so I could watch the situation unfold without looking suspicious. That's when Karen came out of the house with a completely pale face. Her hair, which was always impeccably tidy, looked messier than usual. She held her stomach in one hand and carried a bottle of water in the other. She walked straight across the street to her gossipy neighbor's house, the one who knew everything before it even happened. I couldn't hear everything they were saying, but I caught a few loose words in the air. Water. Strange. It won't stop hurting. What's going on? The neighbor looked at Karen as if she had two heads. You too? You too? Now it got interesting. Karen's eyes widened, but before she could continue the conversation, she had to run back home. And when I say run, I mean that woman took off like she'd been struck by lightning. It was only afterwards that I knew what was happening. Apparently, Karen wasn't the only one to notice that something was wrong with the water. Other people started complaining too. It tasted funny. Some washed clothes were coming out with mysterious stains. Even the neighbors' dogs were drinking less water from the bowls. This was what I call an unintended collateral. I wanted Karen to suffer from it. But the side effect was that some other houses ended up getting some of the special water too. It was only when the number of complaints increased that someone finally took action. The HOA decided to hire a team to test the neighborhood's water. And now things were going to get good, because now, inevitably, the problem would come back to her. If there's one thing Karen loves more than controlling others, it's pretending that nothing is ever her fault. Her house could be on fire, she could be caught in the middle of it, there could be a recording showing exactly what she did. It doesn't matter. The woman always has an excuse, always has someone to blame, always has that look of indignation, as if the universe is conspiring against her. But now the universe really was conspiring against her. The mess really started when the water analysis team arrived in the neighborhood. The HOA, always trying to maintain the appearance of organization, made a point of hiring a company to test the water after half a dozen residents started complaining about the strange taste, stained clothes, and general feeling of unease. The guys arrived with their cute vests, clipboards, and test tubes, knocking on doors to collect samples. And, of course, Karen was at the door before they even rang the bell, ready to play the victim. Finally, I demand that something be done. I've been sick. My stomach is a wreck. My skin looks awful. If I hadn't been so sure that she was holding a bottle of Evian water hidden behind the door, I might even have felt sorry for her. The whole neighborhood gathered to watch the show, because if there's one thing these people love more than watering their plants, it's good gossip in real time. And Karen, she was serving up a full plate. The technicians asked basic questions. When did the problem start? Have you noticed any change in the color of the water? Has there been any recent work on the pipes? And Karen, dramatic as ever, answered as if she were giving evidence at a murder trial. My water is horrible. There's something in my pipes. This is an attack on my health. You need to find out who's behind this. By now, I was holding back my laughter. Not only was Karen demanding that they investigate something she herself had probably done with my grandfather's water, but now she had put a target on her own back. Because, you see, I knew something that nobody else knew. The pipe I tampered with? It was hers. Now the technicians were going to follow the trail of the problem straight to her. And that's exactly what happened. The company's staff started testing the water in each house. The first few were normal, with no significant change. But as they got closer to Karen Street, they began to find small changes. A strange taste here, a suspicious residue there. Small differences that showed something was wrong, but nothing that raised serious alarms, until they arrived at her house. That's where things got interesting. I watched as the technicians took the sample from Karen's tap and made a strange expression. One of them even sniffed the bottle, frowned and looked at his colleague as if to say, "This isn't right." Karen, of course, immediately went into panic mode. "What? What's in my water? Is it contaminated?" The technician, trying to remain professional, replied with a vague, "We need to look into it further, but yes, there is something unusual here." Karen almost had a heart attack right there on the sidewalk. But, it wasn't over yet, because after identifying the contamination, the next step was to find the source of the problem. And this is where the funniest part of the story comes in. The technicians started following the plumbing, trying to understand where the water in her house was coming from. And I, as someone who had done my homework before, knew exactly where this trail was going to lead. Guess what? Straight to the water main that she herself had sabotaged. That's when it hit her. She started acting differently. The previously hysterical and outrageous Karen, who made a point of shouting to everyone that she was the victim of a chemical attack, now started to shut up. She tried to change the subject, asked if the technicians were sure, and even suggested that perhaps the local sanitation authorities had made some changes to the pipes. I almost laughed out loud, but the best moment was yet to come. After analyzing the network, the technicians discovered what I already knew. There had been a change in the flow of the pipes. Something had been tampered with, and, by the divine grace of karma, that's exactly when they found traces of foreign substances in the water in her house, exactly the same as those found in my grandfather's water. Total silence. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but nothing came out. For the first time in her life, the woman was speechless, because now she had just dug her own grave. The HOA, which had always passed her by before, couldn't ignore this problem. After all, the entire neighborhood's water supply had been compromised. And if there's one thing the HOA hates more than an unkempt lawn, it's anything that could generate a bigger scandal than their ability to cover up. And of course, as the good leaders of a small empire of ridiculous bureaucracy, the first thing they did was call in the authorities. And now what? Now all I had to do was sit back and watch the circus go up in flames. If there's one thing the HOA doesn't want, it's scandal. They love to control. They love to hand out fines for out-of-place garbage cans. They love to pick on fences that don't match the palette of the neighborhood. But when something big happens, when something gets out of hand and could involve real authorities, they freak out. And now, right in front of them, was the biggest bombshell this neighborhood had ever seen. The beloved HOA leader in the middle of a possible environmental crime. The presence of the authorities was almost instantaneous. Not because the HOA called them. Of course not. They wanted to resolve everything internally, sweep the problem under the carpet, and pretend that nothing had happened. But the technicians from the water analysis company didn't give a damn about the HOA's reputation. As soon as they detected the traces of contamination and the suspicious changes in the pipes, they called the town hall directly. And, as if by magic, within an hour the street was full of vehicles. Police, environmental inspectors, representatives from the water company. Everyone who could and wanted to turn this into a formal investigation was there. And Karen? Karen was pale. The woman who, minutes before, had been shouting for a solution, was now desperately trying to minimize the situation. Wasn't it just a mistake in the water treatment? Perhaps a fault in the system itself? The policeman just raised an eyebrow and replied dryly, "Do you have anything to say?" She swallowed. As the officers began to inspect her house and take more samples, the entire neighborhood watched as if they were watching the Super Bowl final. The HOA, which had always protected Karen, was now clearly trying to distance itself from her. The president, a man who has always been a puppet in her hands, released a half-hearted statement to the neighbors. The HOA will not tolerate any action that compromises the safety of the community. We are cooperating fully with the investigations. Cooperating? Those bastards were panicking, but the icing on the cake was yet to come. In the middle of the confusion, someone recalled that Karen had had a fight about my grandfather's water supply a few months ago. And, of course, someone mentioned that he had mysteriously fallen ill. Suddenly, the inspectors were looking at this story differently. What had previously looked like just general sabotage of Karen's supply was now turning into something much, much worse. Now, they had a target. The police began to press her, asking if she had tampered with the pipes in the neighborhood at any time. They asked if she knew anything about the chemicals found in the pipes. Karen denied it, of course, but the woman was already shaking, and any idiot could see that her mask was falling off. And then came the best part. While one of the inspectors was inspecting the pipes in her garden, he found something very interesting: a set of tools and an empty chemical container hidden under her deck. Think of a scene from a movie, where the villain tries to escape, but stumbles over his own plan. Karen despaired. She went from pale to bright red in a matter of seconds. "That's not mine. That wasn't there before. Someone put it here to frame me." It was almost sad to see. Almost. The police didn't even bother to answer. They just recorded the material as evidence and continued their investigation. And then came the final blow. The city council decided that it was necessary to redo all the affected pipes. As it was a localized problem, the financial responsibility would fall on the person who caused the contamination. In other words, Karen was going to foot the bill. Now, in addition to being in the middle of an investigation, in addition to being named as the person possibly responsible for poisoning the water, in addition to being dismissed by the HOA itself, she was now going to have to pay a bill so absurd that she would probably have to sell her house to cover the costs. And then, finally, came the scene I'd been waiting for so long. Karen being taken away by the cops. It wasn't a formal arrest. Not yet. But they took her in for questioning, and everyone knew she wouldn't get out of there unscathed. The neighborhood watched in silence as she got into the police car, eyes wide with panic, trying to process how everything had turned against her so quickly. Me? I just stood there, leaning against my gate, savoring every second. My grandfather, who had come out to see the commotion, stopped next to me and let out a sigh. "Looks like the water here is a bit heavy, huh?" I don't know how I kept from laughing. Over the next few days, Karen disappeared. The HOA issued another statement, informing us that she was no longer on the board, and that they were reviewing new guidelines to avoid similar situations in the future. In other words, they were desperate to clear their own bar. Renovations to the pipes began, and, ironically, the only house that really had serious problems with the water was Karen's. In the end, she was forced to sell. In the end, she was forced to sell her house to cover the cost of the damage she had caused. Her lawsuit was still ongoing, but since the whole neighborhood was willing to testify against her, It wasn't going to end well for her side. And what about me? I just sat on the balcony, sipping a cold glass of water, enjoying the breeze and thinking about how sometimes justice comes in unexpected ways. And sometimes it comes straight down the water pipe. And if you liked this video, don't forget to leave your like and comment below.